couldn't agree more. Now we'll come back to the second question. Luby, I want to go to you now. When you are presented with this amazing harvest that you've grown yourself, how on earth do you figure out which flavors go together, what to cook with what, and where do you start?
Well, for me personally, it's preference. I'm very adventurous with herbs, so I use herbs in vast quantities, and I'm happy to try combining different things. I mean, there are always the classics like basil and tomato that we know about, you know, the Italian herbs, the oreganos and marjorams and so forth, and then the more Eastern kind of flavors, which would be corianders and mints and various basils and so forth. But I would encourage everybody to try and just experiment, and if it doesn't work, well, shift it, you know, change and try something else. So even trying unusual combinations it's a great idea. I mean, things like, for example, there's some sage on the table here, and I've also recently been experimenting with our indigenous sage. And so when I say to people they don't know now how to use these new flavors, I say to them, just simply substitute. So where in a recipe you know you would use ordinary sage, try the indigenous sage, and the same for rosemary. In the Ob's garden, both rosemaries, the ordinary Western rosemary and our indigenous wild rosemary are in that garden. And I suggest to people, try them exactly as you would in an Italian recipe, you know, good with lamb and so forth. So just substitute. So go with what culturally is familiar to you and experiment is my advice to people.
I know, sorry, yes.
Could I add to that? Something that I particularly love doing with herbs is fragrant, savory rice. So what I do is I prepare rice 2 minutes before the rice is done. I would have, it's called a mezzaluna cutter, like a double blade cutter, really finely chop pretty much every possible herb from the garden, just a wide bunch of herbs, chop it down into almost pesto proportions, and then sprinkle it on top of the rice and let it steam on top of the rice for 2 minutes, and then turn it in, and it becomes an absolute the fragrance and the flavor. It really takes ordinary rice and takes it to a new level, and that's an easy starting point to just experiment with herbs, an easy way to use them.
You're making me so hungry.
And the other thing that I want to say, especially about soft herbs as well, is that, and it goes back to the topic of waste, parsley stems, coriander stems, all the stems, consider using them. Basil stems, go right to where it starts being woody, because there's flavor in all of those. And I started experimenting like that because when I first started growing basil in my own garden, I didn't have enough. And pesto takes quite a bit of basil. And so I decided, I even use the seeds when the seeds are beginning to form and they're still quite young and very soft. You can throw that into your pesto as well. And it stops you spending hours pulling leaves off stems, which is a complete waste of time considering that the stem is actually really good to use. And if you're scared about the texture, just chop them very, very fine.
Quite right. So what we would usually do is pull off this beautiful green leafy bit and chuck this away.
Bad idea.
That's a real pity.
Bad idea.
So what would you do with the stem of the spinach?
Well, one of the dishes that we made for the feast yesterday was a rice and spinach bake. So what I did was I got the kids to cut the stems very fine, just across, and some onions very fine, cooked those together for a little while in olive oil, then threw in the spinach leaves that were chopped quite fine as well, just until they collapsed and wilted. And with that we mixed in pre-cooked rice and some beaten up eggs and some grated cheese, and squashed that flat into the oven and baked that for about 20 minutes. And it was very popular. It was well received.
It was delicious.
And that kind of bake could be used, you know, rice is one of their staples. And that kind of bake could be used for broccoli. It could be used for several of the veggies from the garden. And then for myself at home, what I'll quite often do is I'll just stir fry them with olive oil. I'm back to the stems now. A little bit of olive oil, and then when they're just soft, squeeze a little bit of lemon juice and salt and black pepper over them. And as a vegetable, absolutely delicious.
Crunchy.
And very, very tasty.